Welcome to Energy Law with Energy Law Prof. Just a brief introduction to a subject that's going to come up often throughout the course, but let's talk about what are some of the climate change solutions to address the problem of global warming that we might accomplish through the energy system, and how much is the world going to pay to accomplish those solutions. So the first thing to understand is that there is a huge amount of uncertainty in what our climate and energy futures are going to look like. So here is a chart of some of the different projections for how much the world will warm in the future based on some different approaches that the world could take to addressing climate change. So the first that you see here in gray basically is business as usual, and not even basically that countries would ignore their existing policies that are supposed to reduce carbon emissions. And you can see that those baseline projections suggest that we would emit enough carbon that by 2100, by the end of the century, we would have about 4.5 degrees of warming. Now that would obviously be very, very bad. Right now, we've had just over 1 degree of warming. It's important to understand these are Celsius, and so that would be more like 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So far we've had about 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, and we'd be like 9 degrees. So that would be much worse than the impact of global warming that we're experiencing already. You can see that if we look at what policies countries have, because countries already have a number of policies designed to reduce carbon emissions. So as long as they stick by the policies that they have, you can see that it's more like 3.5 degrees Celsius in terms of expected warming. So we'll have substantially lower carbon emissions. You can see on the left that's showing you the amount of carbon emissions that corresponds to. You can see that suggests carbon emissions would continue to rise for some time, but would eventually plateau, and that we'd be looking at about 3.5 degrees of warming. So again, substantially worse than the 1.1, 1.2 degrees of warming that we've already had. You can see that if countries met their pledges, that countries have already pledged, not only are we going to keep with our current policies, but we're actually going to reduce our carbon emissions even more. We're going to adopt more strict regulation. Then you get to about 2.5 degrees of warming, and so that would be, and you can see that emissions peak a little bit earlier and then start to fall. Now, certainly, still going to be worse than the 1.1, 1.2 degrees of warming we've had already, but not nearly as bad as those other scenarios. And then, of course, the world's promises about what it intends to achieve, right? Not any particular country, but they say, really, we'd like to keep things to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And what I want you to see there is that requires peaking emissions much, much sooner and rapidly falling off their emissions. And so, I think for all of us, we can live with a little cognitive dissonance about which of these things is actually going to happen. Maybe it's going to do that, maybe it's going to do that, who knows? But one thing I want you to understand is that for energy companies, they really need to know which of these scenarios are we going to hit, because on the margin, maybe we don't need this extra coal power plant if in fact we're going to cut emissions this low, because the only reason we're going to cut emissions this low is because we clearly are going to be taking massive steps to reduce carbon emissions. And so maybe somebody's going to shut down my coal power plant before I ever get paid for it. And really any kind of investment that I would be making in the fossil fuel industry, I have to think like, okay, is this the baseline where we're going to keep using more and more fossil fuel year by year, or is this we're going to use a little bit more but not a ton? And so those decisions are very relevant, right? So even though we may not feel the need to have some opinion about where the world is going to end up, if you are investing in a project that's going to take 50 years to pay off or 40 years to pay off, you really need to know, well, which of these lines are we going to be on? Are we going to be peaking emissions, or are we going to be kind of just plateauing emissions, or are we going to be cutting emissions rapidly? And so there is this uncertainty. Now, there's a lot of different ways to think about what the world is actually going to do, right? You might think, oh, it's going to come closer to what it's not going to do much more than it currently is pledging. Maybe some countries will do more, but maybe some countries will backslide. You could think, I think countries will do what they said they were going to do, right? So if they pledge to do more, I think they will. Or you could say, I think we're going to cut it even more. And there's a lot of different ways to think about that. Another way to think about that is, what's the cost of meeting some of these climate goals versus the cost that climate change will impose on us? And for that, one thing you can look at, William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the economic cost of climate change. This is one of the slides he presented during his Nobel speech. And he said, okay, let's look at the damages that climate change will cause and then compare that with the costs of avoiding climate change. So if you look at this chart, you can see that this base case where we basically don't spend any money, right? So the red is how much money we spend on reducing climate change. You see the base case, we spend basically nothing on that. What is the impact that climate change will cause us? And remember, it's going to cost us all money because we're going to have to harden our harden our cities against extreme heat. We may have to change what kind of agriculture we do or where we do agriculture. We may have to build seawalls. There's any number of things we might have to spend money on. He says, what's the present value of all the costs that we see in the future from climate change if it's completely unconstrained? We don't spend any money on addressing it. And then he says, look, it's about $24 trillion, right? So this is $1 trillion. And that's incredible amount. When you deal with these really high numbers, I think it's helpful to kind of divide them by the population or whatever that you're dealing with. So 8 billion people on the planet, $24 trillion. It's about $3,000 per man, woman, and child in the world. So huge, huge cost, undoubtedly. Then he said, well, what if we tried to meet the Paris climate target of 2 degrees Celsius, right? He said if we did that, that would significantly reduce the damage we experience from climate change. It wouldn't reduce it to 0, certainly, because we still have, we already have 1 degree of climate change. And so, we'd still have more to get to 2 degrees, but it would significantly reduce it. And so the damage from climate change might amount to just about $7 trillion. So maybe just $1,000 per man, woman, and child in the world. So better than 3,000, right? But he said the cost of doing that, just an estimate, and obviously there are so many things that would need to be done to reduce climate change, from switching to new energy sources, building, maybe having many more electric cars, all that. What are the costs that we would pay to accomplish that? And he says, well, it's about $36 trillion, right? So that would be about, really about over $4,500 per man, woman, and child. So actually more than just not doing anything about climate change. Now, it's just one set of estimates. He's changing the estimates that he thinks are correct all the time. There's lots of different estimates from different folks because obviously this is a very difficult thing to estimate. What are all the harms that are going to happen from climate change? What are all the costs that it would take to achieve that? If you believe that it's going to be a lot cheaper to address climate change, maybe you say, oh, it's not really going to cost so much to stop climate change. Or you might say, well, really, I think climate change is going to cause a lot more harm. And so, even if it costs a lot, it might be worth it. Conversely, you might say, I actually think it's going to be really challenging to address climate change. And so, maybe this cost would be even larger. So there can be obviously a lot of disagreement on that. But I do think one thing that this points out, and of course, is that in practice, what countries do to address climate change is going to be dependent both on what are the costs that they expect climate change will impose on them and what are the costs of trying to address climate change. And so, maybe that ultimately, hitting 2 degrees is going to prove too costly, and we may end up hitting 2.5 degrees. Or maybe we'll find ways of meeting that much more cheaply, and so maybe we can keep things below 2 degrees. And so I think those are the kind of considerations that you might want to think about when you say, well, which of these paths are we actually going to end up on? Are we going to end up on the 3 degree path or the 2 degree path or the 1.5 degree path for climate change? Okay, so what are some of the solutions that we could have to addressing climate change? Well, we talked about them. One, maybe biomass, right? So maybe if you are growing forests at the same time that you're burning them, maybe that's going to end up pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. What if you pull that carbon out of the atmosphere and then store the carbon that's emitted from a plant? And so carbon capture could be another big part of addressing climate change. We've talked about, obviously, we talked about renewables, the use of batteries, so basically relying on more renewables rather than fossil fuel sources. Geothermal can be very cheap. It does depend on the location, but people are finding new ways to use drilling technology to make it more available in a wider area of places, which could make that a bigger part. People have talked about the use of wave or tidal power, and certainly that has potential, but it's not widely in use. Often, one of the biggest sources that people identify as potentially reducing our carbon emissions is energy efficiency and basically smarter use of energy. One thing with that, and that can be very optimistic. Sometimes it doesn't work out as well in practice, and so it really depends on the circumstance. But when you think about all the different things that we could do to reduce carbon emissions, you end up with something like this cost curve. And what this is showing you is like which of the things that we could do to reduce carbon emissions would cost us a lot of money versus actually we might save money from doing them. And so some of the things that we often think about, like, oh, that might might cost us money, is things like CCS, which is carbon capture and storage, like capturing the carbon that was emitted from a power plant and storing it in the earth and storing it there so that we'd never experience the global warming from the carbon emissions from burning that coal. Unfortunately, that costs money for every ton of carbon that you store that way. And other things like solar or wind, right? Maybe those cost less money and they avoid carbon emissions. So you can see they're on the right side of this cost curve where they cost us money, but basically they reduce carbon emissions. You see nuclear here as well. Now, what's interesting is there are some other sources, some other things that we could do, like switching incandescent to LED into LED bulbs, right? Or certain things that we can do about building efficiency and making sure they're better insulated, et cetera, that actually might save us money, right? Because they are actually reducing our energy use, and so that means we reduce our carbon emissions, but they save us money as well. So when you look at people like who say, okay, well, how are we going to reduce all these carbon emissions to meet these ambitious goals? Often a lot of the dependence is on sort of efficiency. Now, one challenge is we'll do a lot of, basically efficiency thinking in energy law. We'll see that's a very common part of regulation. But one thing I do want you to keep in mind is sometimes those things that, might make sense in dollar and cents terms don't always make that much sense in terms of what people actually like. And so I'm just going to offer a couple examples of this. One is, I don't know if you know the MLK Memorial Library in DC, but when this was built, there was a lot of sort of efficiency thinking that went into it. It said, let's reduce the energy use of this building. And so the consultants on it, Booz Allen, they recommended that it have low ceilings and no windows, right? And so why would they recommend that? Well, they said that will make it much more efficient to heat and to light. So they basically say, today windows serve practically no useful purpose. Modern lighting and air conditioning methods have obviated the need for reliance on natural light. Now you can decide whether you would like to live in that building with low ceilings and no windows, but it's an important reminder that sometimes we say, okay, this would be much more efficient, it would save us money and reduce our carbon emissions, but sometimes it may go against what humans actually like. And my other favorite example of this is this UN Food and Agriculture Organization report where they were dealing with the problem in the future. People seem to really like to eat meat, and so as they've gotten richer, one thing, that's great, but one thing is that a negative environmental impact that causes more carbon emissions is that people eat more meat. They may eat more beef, chicken, etc. And so said, okay, this is a problem, the impact on the environment. People want to eat meat. Here's the solution, that instead of eating beef and chicken, they can eat insects instead, and that will have a much lower impact on the environment. And I think The challenge with that kind of reasoning is that a lot of times it's not really engaging with the things people actually want. Presumably, if people are wealthier and want meat, they may want beef rather than just something that seems in theory like a perfect substitute. And so I think a lot of times, some of these efficiency measures, I mean, LED bulbs are a great example of one that's been very effective and really reduced our energy use, increased our efficiency. On the other hand, there are sometimes there's efficiency efforts that really end up sort of backfiring because they don't really account for what are the things that people are actually want. And so then a lot of times the efficiency measures are disappointing either because people reject them or because they're not used as intended.